I want to briefly talk about how we actually develop surveys. So we've been talking about variables and the measurement of constructs. I want to talk a little bit about how to actually write good questions to make sure they're easy understood and to make sure we're measuring what we think we're measuring. There is definitely some methodology and some technique to doing this. It's not as easy as just throwing some question downs. And we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges in writing a good survey. So generally when we're writing items for a survey, we want to create an item pool, a reservoir from where, or well from which items will or will not be drawn for the final version of the test. So generally we want to think about what is the construct we're trying to measure, what makes sense to ask, what kind of questions we want to ask, and we generally want to generate more questions than we'll actually use. We then also want to select a response format. Items require test takers to select a response from a set of alternative options. So what is the actual response option that people are going to be using? Because this will also adjust how we actually write the items. We want to provide sufficient instructions and allow for variability. Make measurements of scale useful. So like the Likert strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. We also need to think about floor and ceiling effects, which I'm going to talk about in the final in some additional slides. So what I mean by making the measurement scale meaningful is that generally speaking, we also want to be thinking about what are we actually going to be generating as far as the type of variable from these items. We want to make sure generally that it's probably continuous data. So we want to be asking questions and having a response option that allows us to get there. So for instance, if we ask a bunch of yes/no questions, by their nature, that's dichotomous. That's going to be categorical. Now, that doesn't mean we couldn't sum up the total of yeses and nos to create a more continuous scale. But generally, especially for most psychological constructs, we're probably going to fall in some form of Likert scale. And remember that a Likert scale works best if it is actually basically symmetrical. So if you have a strongly disagree, you should have a strongly agree. If you have a disagree, you should have an agree, and you should most likely have a midpoint. So floor and ceiling effects is also how we ask a question. So if we're wanting to get at a question about how materialistic are you, we could ask a question like, I'd like to have $1 million, but that might result in floor effects or ceiling effects. So if it's a disagree to agree scale, regardless of how materialistic are you, there's a good chance that just about everyone, even the richest people in the world, would still like to have an extra $1 million. It's almost everyone can think of what they would do if they had $1 million for free, extra on top of whatever wealth they had, whether you are as poor as you could possibly be or rich as you possibly be. So this would be an example of getting something that has a ceiling effect. Everyone's likely to say a 5, which means there's not going to be any variance. A better question might be, material wealth is the only thing that is important to me. Now, again, that might actually be an example of a floor effect. Everyone might disagree that material wealth isn't the only thing that's important. Health, friendship, etc. might pass in there. What might be a best question between these two is more, material wealth is one of my primary goals. That might be something that gets us some variability. So in this case, the first question, we're probably going to see most people, if not everyone, put a 5. And that's going to create a distribution that's hard to look for differences. It's going to create what's called a ceiling effect. Likewise, the following question may result in what's referred to as a floor effect, where everyone's basically going to disagree. And again, these don't really give us the variability that we need to be able to look for statistical significant results. So how to ask the question. One of the things to constantly keep in track of is the garbage in and garbage out. So if you have poor questions, no matter how you put them and frame them, you're probably going to result in not necessarily a reliable and valid scale. Question design is important. How people interpret the question. So one of the modern techniques that we often will use when creating new surveys is we'll also ask what the grade level of the questions are. So there's various techniques online that you can simply dump your questions in and they will give you ratings of what is the grade level of understanding. So if I have a bunch of questions that require a college level of education to fully understand and interpret, and I'm giving them to 10-year-olds, there's a problem. If we're basically wanting to have honest answers. Now, if you're in polling and you're working for a particular organization with a particular agenda, you probably don't want honest answers. But as researchers, we want to make sure that our own biases and our own demands upon the researchers or the people taking our surveys is not clear. We don't want them to know what the right answer is. We want their honest responses. So you want to match what you think you're asking to what participants think you're asking. So again, If we have garbage data with perfect questions, we're still going to get garbage results. If we have perfect data with garbage questions, we're still going to get garbage results. We need both. We need good data and good questions. So a problem with language. Let's just briefly discuss some of the issues here. So a survey of 1,255 adults by the New York Museum of Natural History indicated the following. 77% reported they were interested in plants and trees. However, only 39% were interested in botany, which is the study of plants and trees. So again, this kind of gives you an idea of understanding of the questions. Another one was 48% reported they were interested in fossils. However, only 39% were interested in paleontology, the study of fossils. 42% were interested in rocks and minerals. 53% were interested in geology. So we find a flip there. Again, geology is the study of rocks and minerals. People had a better understanding of what geology was than when asked about rocks and minerals. So this just can kind of give you an example of how language is important and what terms we're using will affect our results. 25% believed in astrology, but only 7% believed in horoscopes, which is a direct result of astrology. And most likely that was some people misinterpreting, since this was a New York Museum of Natural History questionnaire, they probably thought astrology meant astronomy, which is a different field, the actual scientific study of the stars and the universe. So again, we want to think about the survey format. We want to have an interval level response. For example, the Likert scale. Notice I put ordinal here. That's because there is some debate whether Likert scales are truly continuous data. What has been found time and time again, though, is that for all of our statistics, using a Likert scale as continuous data does not violate our assumptions. So that's basically going to be our start point. And again, it's pretty much a very easy thing to do. The instructions are fairly straightforward. I am satisfied with it, strongly disagree to strongly agree. It is simple to use, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Again, we just want to make sure that the scales are symmetrical for us to be able to claim equal distance. So when we're writing questions, clarity of questions, they should mean the same thing to all respondents. Generally, a good thing to think about is just try to keep it at a 6th grade reading level, unless you're actually surveying a younger population. You want to avoid complex words and terms. Shorter questions are better usually than longer questions. The consistency, directions should be as similar as possible if you're using multiple questions and multiple scales. You want to basically have positively or negatively worded questions with the exception of reverse coded items. So basically, all the items should either be positive unless you have a few attention check questions that go in the other direction, or all questions should be negatively worded. There shouldn't be a flipping back and forth. Again, you're going to confuse people. People are going to start responding differently, thinking that one sentence was differently worded than another. We also typically want to make it easier for our responders. We want to cluster similar items. So for example, if we have a bunch of questions about activities and a bunch of questions about attitudes, we probably don't want to intersperse those. We want to have people focused on what do I actually do versus what I actually think. And again, this is about how the human brain works and how we're actually formatting information, and we get better results this way. We want to avoid double-barreled questions. So one of the things we can quickly check is anytime we write questions, ask if we're actually asking more than one question with a single question. And usually this is because we're trying to save time and space, or it's because we have a complex question. So generally, if we see any ands or ors in our question, that's a good idea to at least look at it to see if it's a double-barreled question. So for example, I feel welcomed by the staff and other youth at the center. That's 2 questions. Staff and youth. You may feel welcomed by the staff and not by the other youth. You may feel unwelcome by staff, but welcomed by the other youth at the center. Those would be 2 separate questions. So the correct way to do this is to ask 2 questions. I feel welcomed by the staff at the center. I feel welcomed by the other youth at the center. We want to also avoid any double negatives. We want to make these as clear and as easy to understand as possible if what we're after is actually people's thoughts and feelings and responses. We want to avoid loaded and leading questions. These are common in pop surveys and also common in surveys that are basically, they look like they're a scientific survey, but there's a message or a political agenda involved. So social desirability can also be an issue if we're trying to get at honesty. So if we're actually asking questions about racism, even though the person knows that their responses may not be directly tied to them, they're likely aware of what is socially desirable as far as their responses. We might not get true results. A good example of this is there was actually a fairly infamous or famous social psychology study where people were asked their opinions on race relations, and this was done in the 1960s. And they were asked to put it down on a piece of paper. So basically, did you believe, for example, that African Americans should be integrated with white Americans in our school system? So they were asked that question, anonymously on a piece of paper in a large class, and then everyone turned in that sheet of paper. So no one could be tied to their results. They were then asked to stand up, and if they were for the integration of schools, to go to the left side of the room. If they were against the integration of school, to go to the right side. Everyone went to the left side. Everyone did the socially desirable thing. No one was willing to be brave enough to step up and actually let everyone else know their opinion on this subject. When we looked at the actual results of the anonymous survey, we actually found over 50% of the participants were actually against integration. So this is an example of how we have to at least be aware of social desirability. So loaded questions make assumptions of the respondent. So example, I have stopped cheating on my partner assumes that cheating occurred in the first place. We want to be very careful that we don't have loaded questions that basically depend on the truthfulness within the responder. And we also want to avoid leading questions that indicate the socially desirable response. For example, like most Americans, I enjoy fast food. I often see this with political surveys, whether they're coming from the left or the right. They'll make a statement that basically tells you how you're supposed to respond, and then they ask the question, which makes it fairly difficult to go against the social desirability of that survey. So if you've ever seen either the right or the left telling you that survey responses told you that everyone agrees with them, remember that almost every election we've had for the last 30 years has been relatively close. In other words, about half the country is feeling one way and about half the country is feeling the other way, which means that whenever there's a survey that actually indicates that 90% of people agree with one side or the other, I would be suspect of that survey. We also want to discuss if we actually want to have midpoints in our surveys. Even numbers force respondents to choose one side or the other. But what if they don't really know, and can also include an opt-out? So just realize that when we have a midpoint, we are making it easier for people not to have an opinion. In other words, we generally find that if you have the exact same questions with either a 5-point scale or a 4-point scale, definitely people tend to use the midpoint, the 3-point, more often. Now, does that mean they actually really believe that they have no opinion? Or does that mean that they're just trying to opt out because they don't have a strong opinion? So we may find a better representation of attitude if we include maybe not a 4-point scale, but think about a 6-point scale. Slightly agree, agree, strongly agree. We'll probably get a little more variability of people willing to admit, well, I don't care much, but of the options, I slightly agree more than I slightly do not agree. Odd numbers do allow for a no opinion neutral don't know. Generally, though, what we do find in studies is that we want at least 4 to 7 responses. And the true Likert scale actually has 5. If we go below 4, we usually start to run into issues where we start to find that it's actually not enough items for us to really call it a continuous scale. And honestly, above 7 response options, usually we start to see some weird responding, as it's hard for us to actually conceptualize 8, 9, or 10 items at one time. Think about cognitive psychology that has found that most people can keep about 7 plus or minus 2 items in their brain at one time in short-term memory. That also guides how they respond to items. It's pretty easy for most people to think of a 7-point or 5-point scale. It's a lot harder to really rationalize and think about a 10-point scale. What we generally find is that most people, when confronted with a 10-point scale, first decide if they are pro or against, and then they treat them as a 5-point scale, either 5 points for or 5 points against. In other words, we naturally tend to break them down, which just also results in maybe not necessarily giving us the same response options that we're really wanting to get from people. So this is a sample of just some Likert items of a job satisfaction scale. This is not necessarily a perfect scale, but it gives you a good idea. We've got 10 items here, so these 10 items would be average to give someone their score. All of these items are basically been found to be related to each other and basically related to job satisfaction, and they're all on a symmetrical 1 to 5 scale. So I receive recognition for a job well done. I feel close to the people at work. Going on down, all my talents and skills are used at work, and at the very end, I feel good about my job. Now, we might just ask that, I feel good about my job as a single point scale, But notice that we're going to get a little more variability if we ask these multiples. Now, we're not going to know where the differences are because we're just going to have an average at the end. So for instance, if someone has a 5, we know that they're probably across the board good with all of these. If someone has a 3.5, were they 3 to 4 on all of them? Were they 5 on some and 2s on others? We're not 100% sure unless we actually go into the data. So just recognize that as we get a more reliable scale, sometimes we're also starting to lose a little bit of the information that we collected.